Seoul does not slow down for rain. It never has. The Han River district glittered through the downpour like something spilled and never cleaned up. A sprawl of gold light and black glass and the quiet hum of money that didn't need to introduce itself. On a Thursday night in November, the Haesong Grand Hotel stood at the center of it all, its brass doors and marble columns catching the rain like a man who had never once been cold. Inside, chandeliers the size of small aircraft hung over guests in suits that cost more than most people's yearly rent. Outside, the city went on being beautiful and brutal and completely indifferent, the way cities always are. Mr. O, the head doorman, 22 years at his post, a man who had turned away protesters and photographers and one very persistent goat brought in for a viral video, was in the middle of his routine Thursday evening sweep of the entrance when he stopped. Just inside the revolving door, standing on the gold-veined marble as if she had always been there and was only now being noticed, was a child. She was small for 10, the kind of small that came not from genes, but from years of not quite enough. A pale pink dress, clean but old, the hem damp from the rain outside, hung from shoulders that seemed to carry something heavier than fabric. Her hair was a tumble of blonde, streaked curls. I pinned back with 2 small silver clips that were the most careful thing about her, the only thing that said someone had once, at some point, tried. In the crook of her arm she held a teddy bear, brown and worn, one button eye missing, the other black and steady, and watching the room with the same expression as its owner. Her shoes were white. One was scuffed across the toe in a way that suggested a long walk, and no one who noticed. She was not crying. That was the thing that stopped Mr. Ah-oh more completely than anything else could have. Children who didn't belong in places like this cried, or begged, or looked around with wild eyes searching for exits. This girl was doing none of those things. She was simply standing in the lobby of the most exclusive private establishment in Gangnam, dripping quietly on the marble, and looking at him the way you look at someone you have already decided cannot hurt you worse than you've already been hurt. He took one step toward her and opened his mouth. She spoke first. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago that being too loud cost more than it was worth. "Ajiosi," she said, "do you know anyone who doesn't want their daughter?" The lobby did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a room goes cold, starting at the edges, spreading inward, and until every conversation had died and every head had turned and 27 people in designer clothes were staring at a 10-year-old girl holding a one-eyed bear, waiting for an answer to a question that had no good answer. Mr. O's hand was still raised, still frozen in the gesture of dismissal. He had never finished. In a private dining room behind frosted glass on the lobby's east side, Ryu Seojun was in the middle of a conversation that was not officially taking place. And he was 44 years old, lean in the way of men who had never needed to prove their strength through size, dressed in a black suit that fit the way expensive things fit, like it had been made for him and nothing else. His hair was dark with early silver at the temples. His neck and hands were tattooed in the manner of a man who had stopped caring about what that implied, because what it implied was correct. That he was the head of the Heukryong, the Black Dragon Syndicate, and he had spent the last 20 years building an empire on a single principle. That composure was the most dangerous weapon a man could carry. He had never raised his voice in a boardroom. He had never needed to. His lieutenant, Park Hyunwoo, appeared at his elbow without being called. Leaned down, whispered 7 words, "There is a child asking for you." Seojun did not react. That was the thing about him. He never reacted. And he considered, and then he acted. And the space between the two was so controlled it looked like nothing from the outside. He set down his glass. He stood. He walked toward the lobby. What he did not know yet what would not fully arrive until he turned the corner and saw her standing there in her damp pink dress with her one-eyed bare, spine perfectly straight, chin perfectly level, absorbing the stares of an entire lobby without flinching, was that the most fortified wall in his life was about to come down. Not with force, not with violence, but with the quiet, devastating weight of a child who simply said, "I thought you should know I exist." To understand why Kang Jiwon walked into the Haesong Grand Hotel on a rainy Thursday night in November, alone, unhurried, holding her bare like a shield, you have to understand where she came from. You have to go back 10 years. To a divorce that was really an erasure, to a paternity denial written in clinical language on a single cold page, to the moment a man named Ryu Seojun chose to believe the lie because the truth was a room he couldn't afford to enter. And you have to go back 2 years, to the day a man named Baek Junho moved into a house on the outskirts of Gangnam and decided that a half-American girl with blonde curls and her father's eyes was a problem that needed solving. And this is the story of what happens when the problem walks herself to the source and refuses quietly to disappear. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Jiwon heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. Those were nearly silent. The walk of a man who had learned long ago that announcing yourself was a choice, not a necessity. What she heard was the lobby itself changing, the murmur of conversations dropping away, and the soft clink of someone setting down a glass. The particular quality of silence that didn't come from nothing happening, but from everyone paying attention to one thing. She turned. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in a way that wasn't about height so much as presence. The kind of man who made ceilings feel lower simply by standing beneath them. Black suit. Dark hair going silver at the temples, damp at the edges from the rain outside. As if he had walked through the night without bothering to shield himself from it. His neck was tattooed, dark ink disappearing into his collar, and his hands, she noticed his hands first, the way she always noticed hands, were tattooed too, elaborate patterns running from his knuckles upward. The hands of someone who had stopped hiding what he was a long time ago. He was looking at her, and not the way the other guests had looked at her, with the particular discomfort of people deciding whether to feel guilty. He was looking at her the way she looked at people. Carefully. Completely. Reading. Jiwon did not look away. She had learned that looking away invited things. She stood her ground, Gomi pressed against her chest, and looked back. The lobby parted around him without him asking. He walked through it like water moving around a stone, not aggressive, not hurried, certain. He stopped 3 feet from her, and he did something she had not expected from a man who looked like that. He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, until his gray eyes were level with hers. His hands came forward, open, palms upward, the universal gesture of "I am not carrying anything. I am not going to hit you." She had learned to read that gesture too, had learned that it didn't always mean what it was supposed to mean. But she read him anyway, the way she read everyone, looking for the tell, at the flicker, the place where the face and the intention separated. She found nothing but stillness. "What's your name?" His voice was quiet, quieter than she expected. "Kang Jiwon." She paused. Then, because she had come this far, and there was no point now in saying less than the truth. "But Iyama said my real name should be Ryu." Something moved behind his eyes, fast, gone before she could name it. "Who sent you here?" Nobody. Her arms tightened around the bear. Iyama got married again. And to Congressman Beck. She said the name the way she said everything difficult. Flatly, like reading from a document. "He says I'm an inconvenience, a liability." She searched for the exact phrasing she had heard through the wall, the one she had been turning over for 3 days. "A daughter from the wrong father." The man in front of her said nothing. His expression had not changed, but his jaw had. "I didn't know where else to go," Jiwon continued. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady for 2 years. "I thought maybe, if nobody wants me anyway." She stopped. Started again, smaller this time. "I thought you should at least know I exist." The lobby was completely silent. Ryu Seojun, the Black Dragon, the man whose name made prosecutors pause before speaking it aloud, stayed crouched on the marble floor of his hotel and looked at this child for a long moment. Then he stood, removed his jacket, and draped it over her shoulders in one slow, careful motion. She went very still beneath it, the way small animals go still. But she didn't pull away. "Come inside, Jiwona," he said. He turned toward the interior. She fell into step beside him, his jacket hanging to her knees, Gomi still tucked against her chest. They had almost reached the corridor when she stopped. "Are you going to send me back?" He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his jaw was tight. "No." Jiwon looked at him for one more moment. Reading, always reading. Then she followed him inside. The room Seojun gave her was on the 14th floor. It had a window that looked out over the Han River, a bed with white linen folded to precise corners, and a lamp that cast warm gold light across the carpet. Jiwon stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking it in the way someone takes in something they don't yet trust. Cataloging exits, noting distances, making quiet calculations that no 10-year-old should know how to make. She didn't say it was beautiful. She didn't say anything at all. Dr. Shin Yeonhee arrived 20 minutes after Seojun's call. She was 53 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair and the particular composure of a woman who had spent 3 decades seeing things that couldn't be unseen. She had been Seojun's personal physician for 11 years. She had stitched wounds in the back of cars, delivered difficult news in hotel corridors, and had asked nothing about the circumstances that produced either. She knocked softly before entering. Jiwon was sitting on the edge of the bed, not on it technically, just perched at the very border of it, Gomi in her lap. She looked at Dr. Shin the way she looked at everyone new, measuring first, deciding second. "I'm going to check that you're all right," Dr. Shin said, setting her bag down slowly. "Is that okay?" A pause. Then a small nod. The examination was careful and unhurried. Jiwon cooperated with the practiced compliance of a child who had learned that resistance produced worse outcomes than stillness. She lifted her arms when asked, turned when directed, answered questions in short, factual sentences. She did not wince. She did not complain. She simply moved through it the way she seemed to move through everything, absorbing, enduring, giving away as little as possible. Dr. Shin worked without speaking. Her face was professional, controlled, until it wasn't. The malnutrition was visible in the sharpness of Jiwon's collarbones, the slight translucency of the skin at her temples, the way her wrists looked borrowed from a younger, smaller child. Bruising on her left shoulder, greenish-yellow, 2 weeks old at least. More on her lower back, layered, different stages of healing, the kind of pattern that didn't come from falling. A fracture in her left wrist, healed crookedly, and the bone knit at a slight angle that would ache in cold weather for the rest of her life. And then the forearm, a small circular scar on the inside, paler than the surrounding skin, cigarette-sized, deliberate. Dr. Shin's hand stopped. Jiwon glanced down at the mark, then up at the doctor's face. Her expression didn't change. "That one was because I spilled his tea," she said, calm, informational, the way a child explains the origin of a scraped knee. Dr. Shin set down her instrument. I looked at Jiwon for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be right back," and stepped into the hallway. Seojun was waiting with Hyunwoo 6 feet from the door. Dr. Shin pulled the hallway door closed behind her. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she looked down at her own hands. And it was only then that Hyunwoo noticed they were trembling. Slightly, barely, but trembling. She began to speak in the flat. The clinical monotone she used when the information was bad enough that ornamentation would make it unbearable. Severe malnutrition, the wrist fracture, never treated. The bruising, multiple incidents spread across months. The burn. There may be others, she said. I only found one. But the pattern of the other injuries suggests this wasn't isolated. Seojun stood motionless throughout. His face did not change, not once. Hyunwoo had worked beside this man for 9 years. And he watched the only tell he had ever learned to read, the tattooed hands hanging loose at his sides, slowly, finger by finger, curling into fists. This didn't start recently, Seojun-si, Dr. Shin said quietly. Someone has been doing this for years. The corridor was silent. When Seojun returned to the room, the lamp was still on. Jiwon had not gotten under the covers. She had pressed herself into the corner where the headboard met the wall, knees drawn up, gomi tucked beneath her chin, to making herself as small as the space allowed. She was asleep. Her face, in sleep, had finally let go of the careful blankness she wore awake. She looked for the first time like what she was, a child, small and exhausted and fragile in ways that had nothing to do with bones. Seojun stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he walked to the chair against the wall, picked it up, and carried it to the entrance of the room. He set it down, facing inward, sat down, and folded his hands in his lap. But he did not close the door. He did not sleep. The dossier arrived at 6:43 in the morning. Hyunwoo set it on the desk without ceremony, a black folder, unremarkable, the kind that had carried worse things. Seojun was already awake, already dressed, already at the window with a cup of tea gone cold in his hand. He had not slept. He didn't think he had tried. He sat down and opened the folder. The DNA results were on top. A single page, the confirmation printed in clean, to bureaucratic type. He had arranged it quietly through the examination. A routine precaution, he had told himself, the kind of verification a careful man performed before making decisions. He had known before the results. He had known the moment he saw her standing in the lobby, spine straight, chin level, absorbing a room full of staring strangers without flinching. He had looked exactly like that at 10 years old. He set the page aside and stared at the window for a moment, at his own reflection in the gray morning glass. Then the memories came, the way they always came when he stopped moving long enough to let them. Not in sequence, but in fragments. Sharp-edged, precise. Suyeon at the dining table, both hands flat on the surface, the divorce papers between them, already signed on her side. The second page, the paternity denial. One paragraph, clinical language, his name absent from every line, her face across the table, composed, decided, giving nothing away. And the face of someone who had made a calculation and arrived at an answer she intended to keep. His own choice, standing there at 34 years old, to believe her. Not because the evidence compelled him, because the alternative, a child somewhere, growing up without him, growing up believing herself unwanted by a father who never knew she existed, was a room he couldn't enter and continue to function. So he closed the door, locked it, built the empire on top of it the last time he saw her. But her back, walking away down a corridor. She didn't turn around. Seojun returned to the folder. Hyunwoo had been thorough. The dossier on Jiwon's life in the Baek household ran to 11 pages. Household staff accounts, school records, medical visits that were too infrequent and too vague, a neighbor's statement that had never been formally filed. The timeline was meticulous. Baek Junho had moved into the household when Jiwon was 7. The pattern of injuries began 8 months later. So the last entry was a single line, highlighted. Park Soo-yeon was made aware of the situation no later than 18 months ago. No report was filed. No action was taken. Seojun closed the folder. He set both hands flat on the desk, the way Soo-yeon had once set hers on a dining table, and he was silent. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say. The silence of someone with too much, all of it compressed into a space so small and so controlled that nothing could escape. Which was, Mea Yeonwoo had learned over 9 years, the most dangerous version of Ryu Seojun that existed. Yeonwoo said nothing. He simply waited, the way careful men wait near things that are about to break. A sound at the door. They both turned. Jiwon stood in the doorway in yesterday's dress, hair still tangled from sleep, gomi tucked under one arm. She looked at Seojun, then at the room, then at the far corner where the wall met the bookcase. "Can I sit in here while you work?" Her voice was morning quiet. "I won't make noise. I'm good at being quiet." The sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. I'm good at being quiet, not I'll try to be quiet, not I promise I won't bother you. A skill. A thing she had practiced until it was something she offered without irony as her primary credential for being allowed to exist in a space. Seojun looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, crossed to the corner she had been eyeing, and moved the armchair there, not to the wall, but away from it, turned toward the desk. He took the cushion from the reading chair and placed it on the seat. "Sit here," he said. "Not in the corner. Here." Jiwon looked at the chair, then at him. She walked over and climbed into it. Settled gomi in her lap, folded her hands on top of the bear, and turned her gaze toward the desk where he worked. For the first time since she had arrived at Haesong, she was not pressing herself against a wall. If this story is moving, you don't forget to subscribe. Stay with us because what happens next is where everything changes. 1 week passed. It was not a dramatic week. Nothing announced itself. There were no large moments, no declarations, no sudden transformations. Just the slow, quiet accumulation of small things. The kind of things that only matter in retrospect, when you look back and realize that healing, like damage, rarely arrives all at once. Might Jiwon learn the rhythms of Haesong the way careful children learn new environments, by watching first, moving second, and never assuming that what was true yesterday would be true tomorrow. But the rhythms held. Breakfast appeared at the same time each morning. The 14th floor stayed warm. No one raised their voice near her. No one's hands moved too fast. She began, cautiously, to believe in the pattern. Yeonwoo had become her shadow without either of them formally acknowledging it. But he walked 3 paces behind her through corridors, sat outside doors, appeared at the edges of rooms with the quiet reliability of furniture. He taught her the hotel's private elevator code on day 3, ostensibly so she could move freely, practically so he always knew where she was going. She pretended not to understand this. He pretended she didn't. Chef Lim Dae-soo had claimed her entirely. He was a loud man from Busan who communicated exclusively through food metaphors and operated his kitchen like a small, fragrant kingdom. He had decided within 4 minutes of meeting Jiwon that she was dangerously undernourished and that this was a personal affront. "A child with no fat on her cheeks is a soup with no salt," he had announced to no one in particular, and from that moment she had become his official taste tester, a position he treated with the gravity of a military appointment. And she asked him questions constantly. He answered every single one. Gomi had acquired a new button eye, sewn on by one of the hotel's seamstresses, a perfect match in size and blackness, and now regarded the world with bilateral symmetry. Jiwon had watched the repair with an expression so carefully neutral that the seamstress had excused herself to the supply room afterward and stood there for a moment with her hand pressed to her sternum. On day 5, Ryu Seojun found a drawing on the corner of his desk. Crayon on hotel stationery, the lobby rendered in broad strokes, the chandeliers as yellow spirals, the marble floor as intersecting brown lines. 2 figures at the center, a small one with curly hair holding a square that was clearly meant to be Gomi. A tall one beside her, dark-suited with blue scribbles on the neck and hands. Beneath the tall figure, in careful, slightly uneven letters, Appa? The question mark was very small. Like she hadn't committed to it yet. Like she was leaving herself a way back. Seojun placed the drawing in the top drawer of his desk and did not mention it. On the morning of the 7th day, Hyunwoo set a tablet on the desk and tapped the security feed without preamble. 3 days, he said. Different vehicles. Same man. Seojun watched the footage. A figure at the edge of the frame, across the street from Haesong's main entrance, and angled away from the cameras with the specific body language of someone who knew where cameras were. Patient, unhurried, professional. The intelligence report followed. Hyunwoo had been building it quietly, the way he built everything, methodically, without announcing what he was looking for until he found it. Baek Junho had made 2 calls to an unlisted number 4 days ago. The number traced to a private broker with a specific kind of clientele. The conversation, partially reconstructed from a secondary source, was clean of anything explicit. The package, the arrangement. The girl is a loose thread that needs to be cut. The financial motive was on the last page. Jiwon's maternal grandfather had died 3 years ago, leaving a trust of considerable size, locked until Jiwon turned 18. If Jiwon died before that date, the trust reverted entirely to Sooyeon, and Park Sooyeon had not made an independent decision in 2 years. And she was worth more gone than present. Seojun read to the last line, closed the folder, set both hands flat on the desk. Find Beck, he said, and find out who he called. A pause. Double the detail on Jiwon. She doesn't leave this floor without 2 of our people. Hyunwoo nodded. And Hyunwoo ya. Seojun's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She doesn't find out. He looked at the closed desk drawer where the drawing sat. Let her have a few more days of not being afraid. She knocked at 9:47. Seojun knew it was her before he opened the door. The knock was too soft for Hyunwoo, too deliberate for hotel staff. 2 taps, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who had learned to make themselves easy to refuse. Come in, Jiwona. She pushed the door open and stood in the frame for a moment, Gomi under her arm, feet bare on the carpet. She had been put to bed an hour ago. Her hair was loose, slightly tangled, the silver clips gone for the night. She looked smaller without them somehow. She crossed to the chair across from his desk, the large one, dark leather, and climbed into it. Her legs dangled, not reaching the floor. She arranged Gomi in her lap and looked at her own hands for a moment. I want to ask you something. All right. She looked up, direct, the way she always was when the question mattered. Did you know about me? Before I came here? The room was quiet enough that the distant city was audible through the glass. Seojun set down his pen. No, he said. Your mother told me you weren't mine. He held her gaze. He owed her that much. I chose to believe her because I didn't know how not to. Jiwon absorbed this, turned it over, the way she processed everything, not quickly but completely. She told Congressman Baek you were dangerous, she said finally. Bah, that's why he said I should be afraid of you. Are you? Seojun asked. She looked at him for a long time, the same measuring look she had given him in the lobby on the first night, reading for the tell, searching for the place where the surface and the truth separated. You haven't hurt me yet, she said. It wasn't reassurance. It was simply the most honest answer she had. Then she looked back down at Gomi, and she began to talk. It came out the way these things always came out of children who had held them too long, not in a straight line, but circling. She would approach something, pull back, approach again from a different angle. The tea. The way the cup had slipped from her hands and the liquid had spread across the floor and the way his face had changed. The locked room after. The specific quality of the dark inside it. How it had its own weight. How she had learned to count her own breaths to prove the air was still moving. The wrist. She touched it briefly, unconsciously, then stopped. The way Beck could stand at a podium on television and speak about education policy and family values and then come home and become someone the cameras never saw. The way her mother sat at the dinner table during the worst evenings and looked at a point on the wall just past Jiwon's shoulder, as if there were something very important there. And as if Jiwon were not. She stopped, started again. I used to think, her voice went smaller, if my hair was darker, if I looked more, if I didn't look so much like whoever my real father was. A pause so thin it barely existed. Maybe he wouldn't hate me so much. The sentence finished and sat in the room between them. Seojun stood. He came around the desk slowly and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to her level the way he had done in the lobby, the way he always did. His tattooed hands came up and cupped her face carefully, the way you hold something that has already been dropped too many times. You look exactly like you should look, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. You look like mine. She didn't cry at first. She looked at him, reading him one final time, and whatever she found there was enough. Then she cried. Real, ragged, unguarded, the kind of crying that had nothing practiced about it, nothing controlled. She grabbed his collar with both fists and pulled herself forward and didn't let go. He held her, his arms steady around her small, shaking frame. And over her shoulder, his eyes went cold and flat and absolute. Whatever it takes, he thought, whatever it costs. They entered at 2:11 in the morning, service entrance east side, the one used by late deliveries and maintenance staff, the one with the camera that had developed a 40-second blind spot 3 days ago. The credentials they presented were good enough to pass a tired security check at that hour. The man who waved them through would spend a long time afterward trying to understand what he had missed. 3 men, efficient, unhurried. They took the service stairs rather than the elevator, which meant they understood surveillance, which meant this was not their first arrangement of this kind. They knew the floor. They knew the room number. This was professional. But what they did not know was that Hyun-woo had been watching the service entrance on a secondary feed since midnight. He made one call, 12 seconds. By the time the 3 men reached the 12th floor landing, 4 of Seojun's people were already positioned in the corridor outside room 1407, standing in the dark with the particular stillness of men who had done this before and felt nothing about it either way. The confrontation lasted less than 90 seconds. It was quiet, the careful, the deliberate quiet of professionals who understood that noise was its own kind of evidence. No shots, no shouting. The corridor light stayed off throughout. 2 men went down in the hallway. The 3rd ran. The parking garage was cold and fluorescent and smelled of concrete and motor oil. The man made it to level B2 before he understood that the exit had been closed. He turned. Seojun was standing 10 feet away. Jacket off, hands loose at his sides, perfectly still. Not blocking the exit aggressively, just present, in the way that certain men are present, filling the space with something that had nothing to do with physical size. The man was breathing hard. Seojun was not. He didn't ask who had sent him. He already knew. He asked only one question, his voice even and quiet in the concrete silence. "What were your instructions for the girl?" the man answered. It took him less time than it should have, which said something about the gap between how dangerous he had believed this job to be and how dangerous it actually was. Seojun's expression did not change. He took a single step forward. What happened next was brief and would leave no marks that couldn't be explained as a fall. Jiwon woke at 2:43. She didn't know what had woken her. No sound had reached the room, no vibration, nothing she could name. And just the particular instinct of a child whose nervous system had been trained by 2 years of needing to know when the atmosphere shifted. She sat up, looked at the door, opened it. Hyunwoo was sitting in the corridor outside, back against the wall, forearms resting on his knees. He looked up when the door opened. His expression gave nothing away. But he was sitting outside her door at 3 in the morning, which was its own kind of information. Something happened, Jiwon said. Not a question. Everything's handled, Hyunwoo said. Go back to sleep. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she read everyone. Then, quietly, "Is my father okay?" The word landed in the corridor between them. Hyunwoo went very still for just a moment, the stillness of a man recalibrating, and then something in his face, carefully, privately, shifted. "Yes," he said. "He's fine." Jiwon nodded once and went back inside. In the parking garage, Seojun stood with his phone to his ear. "I want Baek Junho in a room with me by morning," he said. "Quietly, legally if possible." A pause. If not possible, then just quietly. Dawn came gray and slow over Seoul. Seojun stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor and stopped outside room 1407. Through the door, barely audible, came the sound of Jiwon's voice, the low, private murmur she used when she thought no one could hear, talking to Gomi. "I think he's going to keep us." A pause. "I think this time it might be real." Seojun stood in the corridor without moving for a very long time. Then he sat down against the wall, his back to her door, and stayed there until morning light filled the windows at the end of the hall. The room Seojun chose was on the 31st floor of a building that housed 3 law firms and an international arbitration consultancy. Boardroom B, floor-to-ceiling windows, city view. A long glass table reflecting the morning light with the clean indifference of something that had witnessed worse. Not a warehouse, not a parking garage, a room where serious men made serious decisions in the language of documents and consequences. More frightening for it. Baek Junho arrived at 9 with a lawyer and a prepared expression, the one he wore at press conferences when questions turned difficult, polished, faintly aggrieved, and the face of a man who expected to negotiate from a position of at least partial leverage. Seojun dismissed the lawyer at the door. Baek hesitated, then stepped inside alone. The table stopped him. It was covered, methodically, edge to edge, with documents, organized in columns, labeled, flagged with colored tabs, financial records, bank transfers, a bound medical report with Dr. Shin Yeon-hee's name on the cover, printed transcripts of phone calls to an unlisted number, signed statements from 4 members of household staff, each separately obtained, each describing the same patterns in different words. Baek looked at the table for a long moment, then at Seojun, who was standing at the far end with his hands in his pockets, watching him with the flat, patient attention of someone who had already decided how this ended. "Sit down," Seojun said. Baek sat. Seojun walked the length of the table slowly, picking up items and setting them down again. And the bank records first. 3 years of diverted trust funds, the amounts modest enough to seem administrative, the pattern unmistakable over time. The broker's phone records. The testimony from the housekeeper who had photographed Jiwon's back on her personal phone, and never sent the images anywhere because she didn't know where safe was. He did not raise his voice once. Beck's composure eroded piece by piece, the way expensive things erode, gradually, then all at once. His jaw tightened. His hands found the edge of the table. He opened his mouth twice and closed it again. Then Seojun placed the last item in the center of the table. A photograph. Enlarged to a 4 size, clinical in its framing. The inside of a child's forearm. A circular scar, pale against the skin, the diameter of a cigarette. The room went absolutely still. "You burned a 10-year-old girl," Seojun said quietly, "because she spilled your tea." The quietness of it was the worst part. No rage, no theater. Just the sentence, placed in the room like a verdict that had already been delivered and was only now being read aloud. Beck said nothing. The color had left his face entirely. The documents were ready. Seojun's lawyer, who had been sitting silently in the corner throughout, a silver-haired man with the expression of someone counting ceiling tiles, slid them across the table one by one. Full relinquishment of any legal claim to Kang Jiwon. A signed confession of financial fraud against a minor's inheritance trust. A letter of resignation from his congressional seat, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. In exchange, a 48-hour head start before everything on that table reached the prosecutor's office. Baek signed. His hand shook on the last page. Soo-yeon's paperwork arrived at her apartment by courier at 2 in the afternoon. Her signature appeared by 3. No confrontation, no phone call. On just a pen moving across a page in a quiet room, relinquishing what she had already, in every way that mattered, given up long ago. At the door, Beck paused with his hand on the frame. Seojun spoke without turning around. "If I hear your name again, in any context, any city, any country, I will not call my lawyers." Baek left without answering. Jiwon was in the lobby when Seojun returned. Sitting in one of the large chairs near the entrance, Gomi in her lap, and still in her daytime clothes at nearly 10 in the evening. She had known something was happening. She had not been able to sleep. She looked at his face when he walked through the door. "Is it over?" He nodded. The breath she released was long and unsteady, the sound of something held too tight for too long finally being set down. She slid off the chair and crossed to him and pressed her face against his chest. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." 6 weeks later, the Seoul family court smelled like old paper and fluorescent light. It was a small room. Wood-paneled walls, institutional chairs, a judge's bench that had seen enough broken families to last several lifetimes. Nothing about it suggested the magnitude of what happened inside it. That was perhaps the point, that the most permanent decisions were made in the most ordinary rooms. Jiwon sat in the front row with Gomi in her lap. She was wearing a new dress, white with small blue flowers. I purchased 6 days ago from a children's clothing shop 2 blocks from Haesong. It was the first piece of clothing she had ever owned that had been bought in her size, for her specifically, with no intention that she grow into it. The sleeves ended exactly at her wrists. The hem fell exactly at her knee. It fit the way things fit when someone has paid attention. Gomi was wearing a bow tie. Chef Lim had fashioned it that morning from a strip of navy silk, tying it with the focused solemnity of a man performing a sacred task. "For the occasion," he had announced, presenting the bear with both hands. "Even bears must look respectful before judges." Jiwon had looked at Gomi's bow tie for a long moment and then pressed her face briefly into Chef Lim's shoulder, which he had accepted without comment and with suspiciously bright eyes. In the gallery behind her, Hyunwoo. He's sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression he used when he was refusing to feel things. Dr. Shin, composed, her hands folded in her lap. Chef Lim, already holding a handkerchief, already losing the battle. Seojun sat beside Jiwon, still, present, his tattooed hand resting on the bench between them, not reaching for hers, not pulling away, simply there if she wanted it. She had taken it when they walked in. She was still holding it. And the judge was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and the weathered, patient face of someone who had presided over too many endings and had learned over decades to recognize the beginnings. She reviewed the file without rushing, made notes in the margin, read a particular page twice. Then she looked up and looked directly at Jiwon. "Jiwon, she said, her voice measured and kind. "I want to hear from you. What do you want? In your own words." The courtroom was quiet. Jiwon straightened in her seat. She looked at the judge the way she looked at everything important, directly, completely, without flinching. "I want to stay with my appa," she said. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. "He keeps his promises. He didn't leave even when it was scary." A pause, brief and enormous. "I've never had that before." The judge was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, and looked down at the file. The gavel came down. "From this day, the child's full legal name is Ryu Jiwon. Ryu Seojun is hereby recognized as her father, with all rights and responsibilities thereof." Jiwon turned to look at him. "Appa." Not a question, not tentative, not followed by a question mark, not offered as something that could be taken back. A fact. A name she was claiming with both hands and intended to keep. Something in Seojun's face, that precise, controlled, armored face that had not broken in 20 years of building an empire, simply opened, or like a window, like a door that had been locked from the inside finally turning on its hinges. He wrapped his arms around her. She grabbed his collar with both fists, the way she always did when she meant it, and held on. In the gallery, Hyunwoo developed something in his eye that required him to look at the ceiling for an extended period. Chef Lim wept openly into his handkerchief without any pretense of concealment. "Doctor." Shin pressed her hand to her mouth and smiled the smile of someone witnessing something they had hoped for without quite daring to expect. The lobby of Haesong had been transformed. The chandeliers were strung with white lights. Balloons clustered at every column and stretched across the full width of the entrance, painted by hand in bright, uneven letters by 17 members of the hotel staff who had stayed late the previous evening to finish it. "Welcome home, Ryu Jiwon." Chef Lim's centerpiece occupied the center table, a towering cake shaped like a bear. White frosted, one button eye, a small navy bow tie rendered in fondant with architectural precision. Jiwon stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, bright, the kind that came from somewhere below the careful control she had worn for 2 years. It filled the lobby the way warmth fills a room that has been cold for too long, and every person in that space stopped for a moment just to hear it. That night, Jiwon slept in her bed. Not in the corner, not pressed against the headboard wall with her knees drawn up. She lay flat on her back in the center of the mattress, both arms loose at her sides, Gomi on the pillow beside her with his button eyes facing the ceiling. Her face was relaxed and open. She was trusting the ceiling not to fall, trusting the door to stay safe, trusting the morning to come. Seojun stood in the doorway and watched her sleep. He thought about the lobby, the rain, a child in a damp pink dress with silver clips in her hair, standing on the marble with a one-eyed bear, asking a stranger the question that had taken him apart. "Do you know anyone who doesn't want their daughter?" He had been that person once. That was the thing he would carry, not with guilt, because guilt was static, and he had no use for static things, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly what he had almost lost by choosing the easier truth. He had not fought for her, had not even known to fight, had sealed the door and built the empire on top of it and called that surviving. Not anymore. He closed the door, softly, completely, walked down the corridor to the chair at the end of the hall, close enough to hear her if she called, far enough not to crowd her dreams, and sat down. Ryu Seojun, the Black Dragon of Heukryong, the man who had built his empire on the principle that nothing could break his composure, sat in a hotel corridor at midnight and felt, for the first time in 10 years, something he had no word in any language for. Something that had nothing to do with power or control or the cold, clean satisfaction of winning. Something that felt, quietly and completely, like being home. If this story stayed with you, if Jiwon's question, her courage, and her small hands holding on, moved something in you, then this story did what it was meant to do. Please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to choose the people who belong to you. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What moment in Jiwon's story will you carry with you? We read every single one. See you in the next story.